This session, I'd like to focus on biodiversity, obviously a component of environmental sustainability, but a key issue, certainly in its own right, but also in terms of our own survival. The fact that we're losing so much of the wild species around the earth essentially is not just almost amoral and almost unacceptable in its own right, but certainly it has an impact on us. So I want to talk about this in a broad sense and looking at both the problems that exist, but also some possible solutions. Now, clearly, the definition of biodiversity is obvious. It's the variability among living organisms, terrestrial, marine, aquatic, other ecological complexes of which they're a part. And this includes the diversity within species, between species and ecosystems. Now, we've seen that predicated on an index starting in 1970, the range of biodiversity has fallen significantly. We see terrestrial species, marine species, freshwater species, all essentially declining significantly over a relatively short period of time, primarily as a result of humans' incursion into their wild spaces. Nature's in retreat. One example, of course, is just the total weight of terrestrial mammals. Humans and domestic animals comprised less than 1% at the dawn of agriculture. Now that combination comprises about 97% of the total weight of terrestrial mammals by the year 2000. The number is probably closer to 98.5% today, with, again, the wild animals, are clinging to the margins of the world that we've created. There is competitive displacement of other species, and it's the inevitable byproduct of continuous growth on, again, a very small planet. So our expansion means that there's contraction of everything else. And there's obviously a fundamental contradiction between population and economic growth and protecting the environment. As we grow, the natural world has to decline. Now, in terms of historical reviews, we know there have been 5 mass extinctions. 4 out of the 5 had carbon at their core, essentially greenhouse gases. And so about every 100 million years or so, the world goes through a mass extinction. The last one was about 60 million years ago, and wiped out 75% of all species. So the question is, are we creating another mass extinction, possibly the 6th, in terms of what's happening? Now, in terms of a snapshot overview, we see population increasing from 1935 till about this current time, from 2.3 billion to 7.8 billion, and just continuing to rise. CO2 levels are going from 280 to 415, but the remaining wilderness that's out there has declined from about 2/3 of space in the world to about 1/3. So it's a dramatic decline over a relatively short period of time. Now, Chernobyl is a classic example of human error. It's a localized tragedy, but on a global basis, the loss of wild spaces is clearly a major problem for the planet. We're destroying, again, a finely honed, a finely tuned ecological machine where that balance is able to keep the world essentially in play. And by disrupting that, we have essentially put in jeopardy our own ability to survive. And obviously, we need to essentially make sure that's corrected. Now, the Holocene, which is what usually geologically is defined as the last 10,000 years, the temperature varied only about plus or minus 1 degree centigrade. And as a result, the life around us and our lives have developed based on that stability. Now, biodiversity helps maintain the stability. The vast herds in the plains of Africa, for example, live off the grass, but they also fertilize the grasslands, and they move, allowing the grasslands to recover. And they need each other in order to survive. The Serengeti translates to endless plains. 250,000 zebra, 500,000 gazelles, almost 1 million wildebeests. However, our globe isn't limitless. It's not endless, as it would be inferred from that translation. We see that in terms of the Apollo space mission. When we saw the picture of the Earth, we recognized that the planet is finite, vulnerable, and clearly needs protecting. About 8,000 years ago, people moved away from hunter-gatherers and started farming, primarily because the crops were available, the animals that we needed were available, and seasons allowed for different food crops. And this single idea certainly would change our world. The next big change was the Industrial Revolution. However, by the 1950s, the pace of change continued to go faster and faster. Um, Till around 1970, we still had tribes in different locations around the world who lived as hunter-gatherers. Um, and again, any species that exists out there that we identify is in our crosshairs. There's no place for it to hide. Industrial whaling ships, we could have eliminated whales. We saved them because they were visible, and publicly we found that on a global basis no longer acceptable, although there are exceptions to that. However, it still goes on, and we'll discuss that in another module. Now, of course, we have broken loose. We seem to be living apart from other species. And to be fair, I think that's almost incorporated in our own thought process. We don't necessarily always see ourselves as part of nature. We're separate and a part of that. We're living apart from them. And again, if left unchecked, we clearly would consume the planet and all its resources until it was gone. And as a result of this, whole habitats for animals have disappeared. Good example is in Borneo, where in 1950, 75% of that land was wild. By 2000, this was reduced by half. So the orangutans have been essentially forced out. They're small numbers to begin with, but they play a critical role in terms of dispersing seeds in their forest lands. Tree diversity, of course, is key to maintaining rainforests. And we're substituting that by monocultures. A classic example would be palm trees to make palm oil. So for this, half the world's rainforests have been cleared, either for things like palm oil, farming, raising cattle. And so therefore deforestation is done primarily because there's value in the wood that's collected, as well as value seen for clearing that for agricultural purposes. And again, Borneo deforestation has created a loss estimated to be about 2/3 of the original orangutans that did exist there. Oceans, we'll talk more about this in the fishing module. The industrial fishing fleets eliminated about 90% of large fish in the sea. In the beginning, full nets now are emptier. And the reason they continue, of course, is the government subsidized these fleets to keep them out there. Without that, it's not sure it'd be economically viable to continue. But from that, of course, the web of life is disrupted. We're eliminating the top chain predators and eliminating their nutrients as well. And as a result, the food source just beneath them tend to swell until they reach the limits of resources, and then they crash. And this continues down the chain. Coral, of course, is bleaching due to climate change. It's gone from a wonderland to a wasteland. Millions of years ago, volcanoes increased carbon dioxide levels over hundreds of thousands of years. But with the burning of fossil fuel, that trapped carbon has been released in less than 200 years. Climate change is the reason the Earth didn't warm up higher, because oceans absorb some of this heat. However, the world is changing, and it won't be helpful to the existence of many species. We're losing our polar ice caps, and therefore the reflectivity of the sun's light is diminished. Tundra is being lost, which means the permafrost will release a significant amount of trapped methane. And there's, of course, the acidifications of the oceans, where shellfish and normal fish will be in peril. The impacts: temperature exceeds anything that occurred in the last 10,000 years. The reduction by 40% of the sea ice since the mid-1930s. And fish levels are 30% below normal. They're at critical levels, where we're cutting down 15 billion trees per year. And freshwater species have declined by about 88%. So we're replacing the wild with the tame. Half the arable landmass is farmland. 70% of all birds are domesticated, predominantly chickens. People are 1/3 of the mass of mammals, and 60% of other species are domesticated farm animals. Pollinating insects, bees primarily, are disappearing. Our impact has been profound on a global scale. It's undermining the very fundamentals of life on the planet. The world is not as it once was. The global decline has occurred in a single lifetime. It's hard to imagine the impact we've had in the last 100 years. It's even harder to imagine the impact we may have over the next 100 years, especially if we continue on our present path. So the longer we wait to address this disaster, which has been man-made, the longer and harder it's going to be to repair this damage. So the big question for us, of course, is what do we do? What are the solutions in all of this? Clearly, they're big ticket items. They have to restore the stability of the planet. We have to restore biodiversity. We have to rewild the world. And it's probably not as difficult as you might imagine just in thinking about it. It requires a system solution. It's not something that happens on a one-off basis. Population, of course, has to decline, but we're seeing that at a global level. We're seeing that population allows for increased standard of living, improved healthcare, educating women. All are factors that decrease the birth rate. We're projected to hit 11 billion by 2100 if nothing's done. And so our difficulty is to make sure we raise the standard of living globally and thereby, ironically, decrease our impact. Japan and any other countries, the birth rate has decreased from 3 children per family in 75 to less than 2 children per family now. And so as a result, the rate of population growth we see is declining. In terms of energy, sunlight could provide 20 times what we need. We need to phase out fossil fuels. Morocco is getting 40% of their energy from solar farms, and they plan to export energy by 2050. In 20 years, renewables should provide the majority of our energy, and we also need to install more efficient energy systems. Our oceans can be an aid in this, but what this means is we have to create and enforce no fishing zones for about 1/3 of our coastline. The other 2/3, of course, we could fish, but that protected 1/3 serves as the hatcheries, the seedbed for continuation. With that, the fishing should allow for us to meet our needs, assuming that acidification doesn't intervene. For the food, we probably need to change our diet. Usually in the wild, one predator needs 100 prey, and certainly we can't do this with cattle. It's a plant-based food and it has increased yield. We consume a great deal of our crops through our feeding of livestock. Usually a factor of 8 to 16 pounds of grain required to make 1 pound of meat. Netherlands is the second largest exporter of food, usually from greenhouses, and they get 10 times the yield per acre with less water, less energy, and almost no pesticides. Forests can trap carbon. They are sources of biodiversity, so we need to halt deforestation. Costa Rica was covered, 3/4 of the landmass was covered by forest. By 1980, it was down to 1/4 of their landmass. It's been replanted now up to half. And again, the driver there, of course, is ecotourism. So we need to return to our forests so they can uptake 2/3 of our carbon emissions. And it's a natural approach to carbon capture. The other one, in terms of what happens with forests, I should also mention agricultural lands, where if we can increase the organic content of our soil, if we can increase it by 0.4% on a year-by-year basis, that can equal the amount of CO2 that we're emitting into the atmosphere. Nature can be an ally. It's completing a journey. So we had sustainable hunter-gatherers, and now we've had an unsustainable current approach where we see ourselves separate and apart from nature. So therefore, we have to adopt a philosophy that we are indeed part of nature and have that be more sustainable. But again, it's not about saving the planet, it's about saving ourselves. And if we don't act, the living world will endure. Quite different from what we know it now, but it will endure. However, we may not. So even though we're maybe the smartest species on the planet, we now require the wisdom to live like that. We can imagine a future. It's not all gloom and doom. There are ways that we can essentially address this and restore the balance in nature of the wonderful world that we've inherited. So with that, I think I'll let you pause here and wait for the next module. Take care. Bye now.